Psalm 15, a psalm of David. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person, but honours those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things will never be shaken.
Thanks, Grace. It is great to see you here today, particularly if you're here for the first time. It is lovely to have you with us. We're just going to work our way through that psalm. As Indy said, it's part of the Bible. I'm going to pause at a couple of points to give you a chance just to talk with the people who are 1.5 metres away from you, so that this is not just a monologue from me, but a chance to reflect on what this has to say in your particular situation. As we begin, firstly, is it very echoey? Feels very echoey. I don't know if someone can make me sound less like I'm in the bathroom, but I'm sure they'll work that out. Thank you. As we begin, how great is Jesus Week already? It's lovely to see you in your jumpers. They are very odd fabrics, I'm sure we've all identified. I've heard different descriptions as to what their inside is. The best I've heard are velvet or velour or furniture upholstery. But I don't know what it is, but they're sort of warm and sticky at the same time. So make sure you wash them on the weekend. They're a really great way of just promoting interest around what's going on. A whole bunch of people wearing them. It invariably leads to questions about, what's that all about? And likewise, well done on so many of you in recording and sharing your video testimonies on social media. I heard this morning that we had nearly 20,000 views of more than 3 seconds of videos. Now, I don't know what that means, but it sounds like a lot to me. I guess it's a way of trying to promote interest amongst your friends that they might ask you what you believe. So make the most of the opportunities. It'd be good to see you next week at both the debate and the talks every day at 1 p.m. upstairs. If you remember what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks, we've looked at Psalm 13, 14 and 15. That's because I said at the start of the series, although there are great initiatives in Jesus Week for you to participate in, and we really want you to do so, the best way to persuade you to be involved in this thing is not to tell you about the great initiatives, but to remind you of what our God is like and why he's worthy of us talking about him with our friends and our classmates. So a couple of weeks ago in Psalm 13, the God who does not forget us. Last week, Psalm 14, the God who is with us. And this week, you'll see the title at the top of your handout on the right-hand side, the God who has invited us over. Now, you might not realise this, but I spend a lot of time deliberately choosing the talk titles. I know you pay no attention whatsoever, but I spend a lot of time particularly choosing the titles, and this one especially is very important. You'll get why by the end of the talk, but obviously it's meant to be vaguely topical, inviting us over, lockdown, blah, blah, blah. You can only have 10 people at a time. It's trying to capitalise on the idea that to be invited to someone's place is a great privilege. And so I'm going to follow the same structure as I have each week. I want to talk for a few minutes about what the passage says about God and what he is like. And then I want us to see how it points us towards Jesus, who is the fullest revelation of God, before finally some reflections on how it applies to us today. And like last week, just to keep you interested, I have show and tell. That'll be something to look forward to. Well, point one then, what Psalm 15 says about God. Like the last few psalms we've looked at, it's in 2 parts. It's a very short psalm, but it starts with a question that raises a problem that gets resolved in verses 2 through 5. In each of the psalms we've seen, actually, they begin that way. They begin by raising a problem. So Psalm 13, you might remember, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? That was the problem that was raised. Last week in Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. There's the problem that's been raised. Look at the problem that David begins with here in verse 1 of Psalm 15. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent, who may live on your holy mountain? This is a psalm that's all about coming into God's presence. That's the imagery there of God's tent or his mountain. There are Old Testament biblical images that the Old Testament Jews were well familiar with. The tent is a reference to the tent of meeting, where God would meet the people on their way out of Egypt in the Exodus. The mountain here is probably a reference to Mount Zion, also called the city of God, the city of David. And in fact, the mountain in the Old Testament was so significant that in Psalm 48, Zion is called the joy of all the earth, the joy of all the earth. So this is a psalm that's all about entering into God's presence. And you might be saying, so what's the problem? What's the issue that David's raising? Well, the issue or the problem lies in the adjectives that he's chosen to describe the tent and mountain. So you can see them there in verse 1. Who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? Okay, so those words sacred and holy, they're a reminder that God is pure and perfect in every way that we are not. God is pure and perfect in every way that we are not. And that therefore sets up the problem. Because if God is like that, if you and I were to come into his presence, then, and this is a metaphor I know you'll understand given what's going on in the world at the moment, if God is pure and perfect and we come into his presence, then we are the contaminant. We are the contagion. There is no place for us before a holy and perfect God. If you stop and think for a moment about the different times in the Old Testament, particularly when people come into God's presence, it is never a positive experience. It is never a positive experience. So think of Isaiah in chapter 6. He comes into the presence of God. His response, woe is me, I am ruined because I have seen God. Or you think of Joshua when he leads the Israelites over the Jordan River into the promised land. He encounters the commander of the army of the Lord. What does he do? He falls flat on his face in fear. Or even Moses. When Moses meets God in the not burning bush, what does he do? He cowers because he understands that there is no place for sinful humans in the presence of a holy and perfect God. And so you can understand David's question. Verse 1, who may dwell in God's sacred tent? Who may live in his holy mountain? Well, let's see David's response. Pick it up in verses 2 through 5. The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honours those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. What it feels like David is doing in verses 2 through 5 is that he's giving an extensive list of requirements of all the things you have to do if you want to come into God's presence. An extensive list of requirements of all the things you have to do if you want to come into God's presence. Let me say a few things about that list. Firstly, whichever way you categorise them, because there's a whole bunch of different requirements, they are all incredibly comprehensive, aren't they? It's incredibly comprehensive. So, for example, you could look at do's and don'ts. There's a whole bunch of do's and don'ts. The do's, verse 2, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from the heart. They're the do's. But at the same time, the don'ts, verse 3, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour, who casts no slur on others. So there's a whole bunch of do's and don'ts. They're comprehensive because more than just avoiding evil, David says this person will take the initiative to bless others. So look at verse 3. They do no wrong to a neighbour. Verse 5, lend money to the poor without interest. In fact, this person, according to David, is willing to stand up for what is right, even if it's personally costly. So look at verse 4, who despises a vile person but honours those who fear the Lord. And maybe the last measure of just how comprehensive this list is that it describes a person and how they act in private, when no one sees what they're doing except for God. So verse 4, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. And that's the easiest thing in the world to go back on, isn't it? Just an oath. Or verse 5, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Okay, so this list of requirements that David gives for someone to stand before a holy and righteous God, it feels pretty comprehensive. Having said that, here's my second comment. Did you notice there is no reference in that list to what we might call religious practices? No mention whatsoever of any religious practices. No mention of religious practices as a requirement to enter into God's presence. No mention of offering sacrifices. No mention of giving tithes. No mention of serving on a church roster, to use the language that we'd probably be familiar with in our context. Now, don't get me wrong, such religious things are important, but verses 2 through 5 are a reminder that God sees the whole of our lives. He sees more than just what we do on a Sunday morning in church or midweek when we gather for home group. God sees what we do with our whole life, and that needs to be taken into account. For myself, personally, that's the realization that God sees everything about me, not just what I say on Sunday morning. That's why I became a Christian. I became a Christian in my mid-teens after years of going to Sunday school and learning to give the right answers when asked by the Sunday school teachers, so that I could confidently say on Sunday morning Jesus was my saviour. But it was only in my mid-teens that I recognised that what Christ has done for me demands my life every day. He is to be my Lord. Okay, and maybe the only final thing I could say about this list that David has given here is that the description that he has, it is universally applicable. It is universally applicable. That is, you could do all of those things irrespective of your specific circumstances. They could apply whatever your station in life, whatever part of society you occupy, whether rich or poor, whatever your socioeconomic class, whatever your racial background. These are universal. So, having sketched out how comprehensive this list is, here's the question I want to ask you today. How do you feel when you hear that list? How do you feel when you hear that list? Because if this is the list you need to check off to be admitted into God's presence, that's got to cause some kind of reaction in you. Now, at one level, partly your response to my question, how do you feel, will depend on who you think it's being applied to. If the list is being applied to other people, that's okay. In fact, if the list is being applied to other people, I actually find myself thinking, I'd love to surround myself with people who all live that way. I mean, that would be a pretty good community to be part of, wouldn't it? But of course, as we know, the problem becomes, what if the list is applied to me, to you? How do you feel at this point? Well, this is where it gets tricky, doesn't it? Because it's such a comprehensive list, and then we remember how inadequate we are by comparison. And I think that leads us to one of two responses, neither of which are right. Being confronted by a comprehensive list and our inadequacy, one of two responses, neither of which are right. The first wrong response is that you feel guilty and depressed. You know, I can't do this. Who on earth could ever keep this? And you give up. This is the risk for those of us who are especially sensitive to our failures. On the other hand, an equally wrong response, I think, is apathy or denial. You read this list and you think, actually, do you know what? I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. It doesn't really apply to me. Of course, the difficulty with that is that that's not how the Bible assesses our character and our conduct. Do you remember last week, Psalm 14? There is no one who does good, no one who is righteous, not even one. Now, in some ways, those two responses, the one that you lean towards is often conditioned by your default personality, how you think about yourself generally, what kind of level of self-esteem you hold yourself in. So in fact, I think the better question for us to ask in Psalm 15 is not how do you feel when you read that list? The more important question to ask is, what's the purpose of the list? Why has David put it here? And so here's my big idea for today's talk. And you'll see I've given you a couple of sentences on your handout with some check boxes for you to tick one or the other. My big idea for this talk is that the purpose of the list in verses 2 to 5, the purpose of the list is not to answer the question, how do I get in the front door of God's house? Rather, it's designed to show the way we live once he's welcomed us inside. The list is not trying to say all the things you have to do to be invited in to God's presence. The list is describing the way in which God's people live once they have been accepted by him. And so if you look at the checkboxes, tick the second one, obviously. Psalm 15 is describing the way we live once we're inside. Now, why do I say that? Well, I say that because of the last line of Psalm 15, which is the only verse I haven't read out yet. Look at how it finishes. Psalm 15, verse 5, third line. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. You see, Psalm 15 doesn't finish by saying, whoever does these things, this incredible list, whoever does these things will be admitted. It doesn't say that. It says whoever does these things will never be shaken or moved or destabilized. And I think the implication, therefore, is that this is the psalm, a song of someone who knows they have been welcomed into God's house. They are not trying to find their way in through the front door still. Part of the reason I say that is because presumably David thinks it is possible to live the way in which Psalm 15 describes. Otherwise, listing all those requirements in verses 2 through 5, all that it would do would prove our unworthiness. It will be David setting an impossibly high standard, a bar that no one can reach, meaning that Psalm 15 in the end would just be a cruel hoax that offers no hope of you ever being welcomed in God's sacred tent and on his holy mountain. Rather, if I'm right, if the purpose of Psalm 15 is to show us how to conduct ourselves in a manner that's worthy of our God, in a manner befitting of the host who has invited us in, that leads to a third response. A third response, neither depression nor denial. Rather, that leads to the response that you can be really excited about the thought of living in a way that pleases God. So the phrase that I printed there for you on your handout, Psalm 15 is not a guilt-inducing diagnostic tool. It's not a guilt-inducing diagnostic tool designed to point out all your shortcomings and leave you in despair. Rather, it's a liberating life guide. A liberating life guide to show us how we can live in a manner that befits the God who has been so good to us. Now, let me say, I realise that even in putting it that way, in what I've just said, those of us here who have very tender consciences, who are very sensitive, who I've referred to earlier, you're probably sitting there thinking, oh, thanks a lot, Jeff, there's yet another thing I haven't done. So that's not my intention. That's not why I'm trying to put it this way around. What I am trying to say is that this is a psalm that's meant to bring delight to us, not despair. And one of the reasons why I've done it that way is because hopefully what I'm saying helps us to avoid the mistake of thinking that the Old Testament law is nothing more than a rule book that highlights all our failures. And only after that leads us towards Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong, Jesus is the one who provides forgiveness because only he can. But the law is much more than just a diagnostic tool. I mean, look at Psalm 19, which I've printed there on your handout, just a few verses from it. Listen to the incredible way in which it describes the law of God. This is not a guilt-inducing diagnostic tool. This is a source of great delight and joy. Listen to these words, Psalm 19, verse 7. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the law are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the law are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the law are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. Look at those words, sweeter than honey, purer than gold, a joy to the heart, refreshing the soul. This is a description of how wonderful God's law is, how liberating it ought be. And anyone who can say that, they have to be utterly convinced that living God's way is not meant to be a terrible burden, but rather a wonderful delight. I wonder, actually, if that's the reason why David can still say, whoever does these things will never be shaken, even as he acknowledges his own dreadful sinfulness. Still, he can say these words with great confidence. Well, there's a reflection on what Psalm 15 tells us about God. I'm going to pause at this point and give you a chance just to turn to the person 1.5 meters away from you and for a couple of minutes talk about the first of the discussion questions, which I've put at the bottom left. First discussion question: how do you react to the suggestion that Christianity is all about keeping rules and regulations? And why? Like, what caused you to react that way? Okay? A couple of minutes, just talk with the person next to you. I'm not going to ask for feedback, so chat away, and then I'll gather us back together. Over to you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for taking the time just to start the conversation. You'll be able to come back to that in a couple of minutes. But as I said, we're keen for it not just to be a monologue, but a chance for you to try and think about how this applies in your situation. So point one, and this is most of the talk, what Psalm 15 tells us about God and what he's like. Let me move more briefly then through points 2 and 3. Point 2, how Psalm 15 points us towards Jesus. Well, as we've seen throughout this series, there's lots of different lines of trajectory from the Old Testament to the New and from the Old Testament to Jesus. A couple that sprang to mind as I thought about this passage. Interestingly, Jesus raises the bar even higher than David does in Psalm 15. Jesus is the one who, as we saw last week in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he says to love your neighbour as yourself, and actually expands the definition of neighbour to even include your enemy. So Jesus, in a sense, he raises the bar. But equally, Jesus is also the one who does assure us that we can please God, that we can live in a way that is a delight and a pleasure to our Heavenly Master. So, for example, think of some of the parables that Jesus tells, particularly the one about the master and the servants. The master who goes away, leaves servants in charge. We often focus on the third servant who does the wrong thing, but actually the first two servants do the right thing, twice as many, and they bring a great pleasure and delight to the master. But I thought actually the reflection I'd have in terms of Psalm 15 coming through to Jesus for us today is this. I want to say to you, if you're not convinced still that you are worthy to be in God's house, if you're not convinced that you're worthy to be in God's house, the good news of the gospel is that in Jesus, God has taken up residence amongst us. God has taken up residence in us. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honour God with your bodies. Last week we saw that God is with us collectively. He is amongst his people. That was 1 Corinthians 3. This week, 1 Corinthians 6. God is not just amongst us. God is in each of us by his Spirit. And he is with us wherever we go in his world. Well, let me try and wrap it up then, both this talk and this series of point 3, what Psalm 15 asks of us today. And back to my big idea for this talk. Psalm 15 is not about all the things you must do to be admitted into God's presence. Instead, Psalm 15 is about how we live once we're inside, once we know that we belong. And that's why I said the title of my talk was very important, even though none of you paid any attention to it. So, because what I didn't say was the God who invites us in. I called it the God who has invited us over. Because there's a world of difference in the picture that it paints of what God is like. Either we're desperately trying to meet the entry requirements, never certain if we've done enough to be admitted inside, or we are joyfully planning to live God's way in God's house because he has already accepted us in. I trust you can see the difference in the pictures of God that paints. I trust you can see that from the human relationships that you have. Because I know that every person in this room can tell the difference between someone who says, if you do this, I will be your friend, and because you're my friend, I will act this way. We can all tell the difference between that. So too with God. And so then to show and tell. Show and tell. Okay, so here's my thing to try and help this idea stick in your mind as we finish up. Show and tell. Now, remember how I said that Psalm 15 is not meant to be a guilt-inducing diagnostic tool. It's meant to be a liberating life guide. And my argument is that Psalm 15 is not a damning list of entry requirements that none of us can keep, rather a reminder of how we live once we're inside. Okay, so that's my idea. So, who has seen one of these before? Oop. One of these. You know what I'm talking about? House rules. You know, it's the kind of thing. This one here says, always be polite, be thankful, love your family, respect each other, and so on. Yeah, looking around, most of you have seen this kind of thing before, right? Okay, now why have I brought this in? Well, I brought this in because if you get one of these things, where do you put it? Well, most people put it over the fireplace or in the kitchen, right? No one puts it on the front door greeting people who are coming, do you? If you did it that way, it'd be like a dress code, you know, that you have to meet before you're allowed into the venue. Instead, you put it inside because it says, this is how we live. This is who we are. Slightly different illustration. I go to an Anglican church, Holy Trinity actually, most of you know it. It's a very old Anglican church and therefore somewhat traditional, which means that like lots of Anglican churches, it has a copy of the Ten Commandments printed and stuck up somewhere. Now, here's the funny thing, of course. Some of you go to Trinity, probably many of you don't even know that because you've probably never seen it, because it's put in about the most obscure place you could possibly find. It's on the back wall tucked away in the corner. Because very wisely, it's not stuck on the front door facing out to North Terrace. What it describes is how we live once we're in, not what we have to do to be admitted. Well, if you're here today as someone who's not a believer, then to add my welcome to that of Indy's before, thanks for giving us some time. to come and hear about what the Bible has to say and how it might be relevant today. I do hope that you'll join us at Jesus Week next week. We'll have talks like this and a debate every day at 1 o'clock upstairs, Monday through Friday. Come to as much as you can. It'll give you a chance to hear a little bit more about what Christians believe and why that makes a difference. I hope for you that what you've heard today paints God in a more positive light. See, what I've tried to say today is that God longs for us to come to him. In fact, he has gone to incredible lengths to bring us into his house. He has even sent his own son out to gather us. And although it's a topic for another day, according to the Bible, the way in which God's son secures entry for us is through his own death. That's how much God wants us in his family. If you are a believer, on the other hand, to the members of ES, here's where I want to finish up this talk in this series. I want to say to you today, rejoice. You can please God more and more. You can please God more and more. Maybe one last illustration to make the point that knowing how to live in God's place is actually a wonderful blessing, a great relief. To be invited into the rarefied air of God's throne room, that might sound terrifying. It was for the Old Testament believers, but for us actually we can have a great comfort in that. To give you an illustration, imagine, if you will, that you got an invitation to go and have tea with the Queen. Now, I don't know why you would, but let's say you got an invitation to come for tea at Buckingham Palace. My guess is that before you went, there's a whole bunch of things you'd like to know about how to act once you got in the door. Like how should you address Queenie? I'll give you a hint, probably not that way, or Lizzie or any of those kinds of things. What should you wear? Which knife and fork should you use? So, because if you knew those things before you went, you wouldn't be terrified. You'd be able to relax. Maybe even begin to enjoy yourself. Well, I want us to finish with a second discussion question, which you'll see printed at the bottom left there. It's one of the descriptions of how we live from Psalm 15, which I touched on before. It's the question around how we act when no one but God sees us. So the question there, what decisions will you make in private which no one else sees or knows about? Because they're actually the hardest decisions to make. How will you act at work when your boss isn't around? Or in your bedroom at night when you're online? Or when you're alone with friends or a boyfriend or a girlfriend when you think no one else will know? Hear Paul's words of encouragement from 1 Thessalonians 4 on the bottom of the right-hand side. We instructed you how to live in order to please God, as in fact you are living. Now we ask you and urge you in the Lord Jesus to do this more and more. This is what we aspire to do. And I know we won't always reach that lofty standard, but we don't give up trying, because this is how we live in God's house. Okay, time for a couple of minutes for you to turn to that person 1.5 meters away from you and talk about that question for a couple of minutes, and then I'll call us back for any questions that you might have. Okay, over to you. Okay, well, I'll draw you back together. Thanks very much for taking that time to share and to talk with those around you. Just on 5 to, got a few minutes still. Any questions that you have about today's talk? Anything you'd like to come back on? Yeah, Joel. The sacred tent. Yeah, I suspect it is. It's probably a reference to the tent of meeting. So where, as they were moving around in the desert, that's the place at which they met God, and where, in a sense, God dwelt until the building of the temple on the mountain of Zion in Jerusalem. So, yeah. Thanks. Other questions? Yes, there is a question. Sorry, you are silhouetted. Louis. Yeah, thanks. A really good question from Lou. How do you know where to draw the line between legalism and living God's way? It all depends really on the starting point, I think. So if you think that your conduct is what makes you acceptable in God's sight, you'll end up being a legalist. If you think, on the other hand, that God in his kindness has declared you to be acceptable in his sight because of what Jesus has done for us, then the way you live will be a response to that. And that's, I think, what Psalm 15 is inviting us. It's pointing us in that direction. It's not as clear here as it is in the New Testament because, of course, the whole problem for an Old Testament believer is that they'd have the nagging question in their mind, what about my sin, which I know is real and is ongoing? There was a sacrificial system developed in the Old Testament whereby your sin could be atoned for, but any half-thoughtful Jew could tell that sacrificing an animal in your place doesn't really take your sin away. They're not like for like. They're not fair comparisons. So it's pointing forward to Jesus, who does fully remove sin because he is perfect in the way in which we're not. And therefore, the way we live is actually an opportunity to reflect our desire to please him and to live for his honour and glory. So those are the two things that you want to bear in mind, but it all begins at the starting point. Yeah, thanks, Louis. Sarah. Yeah, have we just not told them what's happening until it's too late? Yeah, well, you're raising a good question there, which is, it depends on the basis on which someone has come to put their faith in Jesus. You don't have to know everything about God to become a Christian, but I think there are some things you do need to know, and one of them is you need to be aware of your own sinfulness, which of course is a challenge for us because we don't like to start conversations with classmates with that. We actually want to start with here is the benefit to you. And I get why we want to do that, but you actually have to start with the problem. So I think if you started with the problem, then when you come back to the idea of living God's way, it's not new to people that being a Christian means you live in a particular way, but the motivation for it is different. And in the end, we all know this, right? None of us are perfect. So the thing that ultimately matters is our motives and desires, why you do something. And you know that actually from life. The reason someone does something is as important, if not more so, than the actual outcome of their actions. So, yeah, those are the kinds of things that you need to think through there. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. All right, Indy is lurking, which means my time is up. So, thanks, it's great to see you. I hope I will see you around plenty next week. Indy, come wrap up for us.